Welcome, my patrons. This is Darnley Cyber Café, a cyberspace for thoughtful conversations about cybersecurity, privacy, and the quiet ways technology shapes our lives, where we take real stories, slow them down, and figure out what they actually mean for you. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you're here. Take a seat. And if you've been here before, welcome back. In recent news, Wired, the technology publication, reported a loss of control over a user database tied to millions of accounts. That's what we're going to unpack today. A hacker using the name Lovely, which kind of sounds like one of my old flames, recently released that they claim is a large database connected to Wired user accounts. Security researchers who've reviewed samples of the data believed it's legitimate, and the numbers being discussed are in the millions. The information itself isn't passwords or credit card numbers. It's email addresses, internal account IDs, timestamps, and in some cases, names, phone numbers, and physical mailing addresses. Now that detail matters, because even when it doesn't feel sensitive, it's still personal. It still connects the dots, and it still creates context. Condé Nast has not publicly confirmed every detail yet, which is fairly standard in situations like this. What's also being discussed is that Wired accounts may be part of a shared system used across multiple Condé Nast brands. And that's worth sitting on here for a moment. When companies centralize accounts, when one login works everywhere, convenience goes up. But so does the blast radius when something like this goes wrong. And once data leaves the system, there is absolutely no rewind button. And I honestly hear this all the time. This is no big deal, because they hear no passwords were leaked and they think, all right, we're good. Nothing to be concerned about here. But that's not how this works anymore. An email address tied to a real name, maybe a phone number, maybe an address, that's enough to build a profile. It's enough to make messages sound legitimate. It's enough to remove doubt. Enough to pass a casual sniff test, so to speak. But understand, this is how phishing gets better. This is how these scams stop looking like scams. This is how people get pulled in without realizing it. And most of the damage from breaches like this does not happen immediately. It shows up later, very quietly, without making a big deal, or with significant pomps and circumstance. An email that looks normal, in a request that feels routine, in a moment where nothing seems off, until it is. That's why stories like this matter. Even when they don't feel dramatic, believe me when I say this, that I honestly cannot say this enough. And I'm sure if you are a listener, I've said this plenty of times in previous podcasts. But I just want to illustrate a real quick Darnley analogy for you to understand cyber leaks. So let's think of a data leak, like a faucet dripping. So let's do the math. It's 1 drop of water per minute, 60 drips per hour, 1,440 drips per day, which is 525,600 drips per year. If anyone's seen the Rent musical, yes, playing in my head as well. But anyways, that's about 131.4 liters or 34.7 US gallons a year. A drip a minute doesn't flood your house, you barely notice it. But a year later, you've got a surprising amount of water sitting in a bucket. Data leaks work the same way. One exposed email here, one name there, a phone number, an old address. None of it feels overly catastrophic on its own. No passwords, no credit cards, so people just shrug. But that slow drip accumulates into a usable profile over time. And once enough drips collect, scammers don't need a dramatic hack. They just need a convincing message built from small truths, such as your real name, the service you've used, the time you've signed up, and maybe a phone number or address. A drip a minute turns into a bucket. A leak of non-sensitive details turns into identity-level context. And that's the dangerous part. It's not just a single breach, it's the accumulation that makes you easier to target. I want to share with you guys a story because we've normalized this drip. And I hate to say this, but I'm not saying about your nice outfit. This kind of drip is not cool at all, and this does apply to some of you younger patrons of mine. Understand, data breaches have just become background noise to us all. It's just another headline, another shrug, another, oh well, what can I do? But I want to share something that I've seen firsthand, one of many, might I add. A while back, in my beginning years, I've worked with a client, a small business, which was in the printing sector, who got caught up with a breach very similar to this one. No passwords were leaked, no financial data exposed, just emails, names, and account details tied to a service that they trusted. At first, nothing happened. But then a few weeks later, employees started getting emails that looked completely normal. Familiar names, real context, messages that didn't raise alarms until it was already too late. One click turned into stolen credentials. That turned into internal access, client information theft, etc., which turned into a long, expensive cleanup for them. And then when we traced it back, it just didn't start with a dramatic hack or anything grand. It started with data that didn't seem important at the time. And that experience stuck with me because this is how most real-world incidences unfold, not with fireworks, but with quiet assumptions and delayed consequences. And that's why I push back when people say, well, at least it wasn't passwords. Well, because sometimes the most dangerous data is the kind that helps attackers blend in to their surroundings. So if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, what can I actually do about it? Well, that is the right question. Awareness without action does not change much, but small, deliberate habits do. So, what can you realistically control? Understand this is not about perfection. It's about reducing your exposure. If you ever had a wired account or any Condé Nast account, here's where I'd start. First, check whether your email has shown up in known breaches. Sites like Have I Been Pwned, and spelled P-W-N-E-D, these sites exist for a reason, because knowledge beats guessing. Second, if you reuse passwords anywhere, and this is your moment to stop doing this bad habit, like do this now, not later, not someday, just have one password per site, full stop. A password manager makes this far easier than most people expect. It certainly has saved my skin and reduced the amount of guesswork on my end significantly. Third, turn on two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication whether it's available. Even the most basic 2FA adds friction attackers don't want to deal with. They just want the lowest hanging fruit or ones who don't have these extra friction profiles added to their accounts. Number 4, stop and slow down when something feels urgent, because breach data fuels pressure tactics. Urgency is often the telltale sign. Those do this now or lose this thing forever, for instance, is another telltale sign of the fact that this could be a pressure tactic. And finally, clean up your old accounts. If you don't use it, close it. Less data out there means less surface area for attackers to use against you. I know. None of this is exciting, none of this is fun, but trust me, from my over 10 years experience here, it works. Because this is why I keep preaching this, because I've seen those who follow these simple, boring steps, they avoid many attacks, and comparison to those who don't, these are the ones I these are the ones I end up working with. So typically, from what I've seen, they share the same story on how they got to that point. So honestly, save yourself time, money, and energy by just following these steps for a more easier future. So that wraps up today's conversation. Not a catastrophe, not the end of the internet, just another reminder that trust online is conditional and always has been. If this episode gave you a different way of looking at how your data moves through the world, that's a good place to pause and reflect. And if you found it helpful, thank you for listening to Darnley Cyber Café. Sharing this episode with someone who would benefit from it helps more than you might realize, especially when these stories don't always make the front page. I'll see you next time, same cafe, new conversation. And as always, when you understand how these systems and hackers work, you are harder to mislead and much harder to exploit. In a digital world built on speed and assumption, knowledge becomes your leverage. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.